here is Mark joining us from not the Twilight Zone, but from Ohio. And here is the one and only Anne Serling joining us here on the program as well. Folks, thank you so very much for joining us on the Jim Masters Show. It is an honor and a privilege and a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
Yep. Great to be here. Thanks, Jim.
You're very welcome. Super fan of Rod Serling, super fan of the Twilight Zone and everything Rod Serling for me. But I'll start with you, Mark. What was it about Rod Serling and about the program that inspired you to the point that you wanted to take all of this time to pen this sensational book? And congratulations on it.
Thank you. It's my favorite TV show of all time. It always has been. Nothing has ever displaced it as my favorite show. I discovered it when I was about 10 years old. I was not old enough to have seen it on its original run. But a station in New York where I grew up, good old WPIX Channel 11.
Channel 11, yes.
Rerun it almost immediately. And that's when I first became aware of it. And at that age, I just loved it for the spook out factor. I was 10 years old and I thought, this is that delightful time at the end where, the hairs in the back of your neck would go up. And that was the best part for me. And as I got older, and as a teenager, I started to realize that there was something behind all of the fantasy, that there were these life lessons and these moralities tales. And, there are basically parables. And as you get older, you become more and more in tune with what the Twilight Zone is behind all of that. And that's where, I really fell in love with the Twilight Zone was about high school, because when I was also falling in love with writing, and Rod Serling became one of my heroes. If you grow up in the 1960s like I did, and most of the heroes you were given on television and the pop culture, these were mostly people who carried firearms. They fired guns, and that's not to say a lot of people who do that aren't heroes. They are. But in high school, I became aware of that some heroes are people who carry ideas, that carry words. And I felt good and forever under the spell of two writers when I was in high school, Mark Twain, can you tell, and Rod Serling. And I've carried the two of them throughout my life. And getting to write this book was just a complete joy and honor, because it really feels like you're celebrating this show that meant so much to you, and this writer who meant so much to you throughout your life.
You mentioned Mark Twain. Have you ever gotten a chance to visit the Mark Twain house in Hartford, Connecticut?
I've played Mark Twain at the house in Connecticut.
Isn't that a fantastic? And the Harriet Beecher Stowe house is right next door. Love that place.
Don't really need a whole lot of makeup to do it anymore.
No, it's perfect.
I've been doing this since I was 22 years old. I'm 68. If you want to do the math, that'll tell you how long. And and I do an entire talk about the parallels between Mark Twain and Rod Serling.
The only other person I ever met that did play him in the way that you do so beautifully was Hal Holbrook.
Good friend, dear friend, yes. for 35 years. I would have never even stepped on stage without Hal's knowledge and permission and guidance in playing Mark Twain. So one of my books is dedicated to Hal. And he showed us all how to do it.
Absolutely. And you and I were chatting before we went on the air, and it's such a delight to have you here, and an honor and a privilege. And I would imagine that it must be a real hoot to see and feel, not just see, but feel truly the love that people have, the respect that people have, people like me who are fans and viewers, but also working in the broadcast industry as well, and looking at your dad's work from two vantage points, kind of like Mark does as well, not just the viewer who sees it for the entertaining purposes, but also for the morals, the lessons, and also just taking a look at this, the show and the series, The Twilight Zone, for the lighting and the music and the camera angles and all these different aspects that we revere and love. It must be something special for you to know all these years later, the person that we consider, a master of his craft, your dad, is still beloved today.
It's incredibly touching, and people are so kind with their feedback, and They expressed the impact that my father had on them, either as writers or just as human beings. And as I mentioned to you before, more than a few people have told me that they had tumultuous childhoods and thought of my dad as their father. And my dad would just be so stunned to hear that, and so honored and touched to know that he still remembered and remembered so fondly.
It really is amazing. And when people like Mark, who are prolific writers and love history and the arts and theater and television and all of it, and is also a fan of the work like I am, pen fantastic books like that, it's got to be extra special. It may surprise people, like you say, that your father would be completely bowled over by the fact that all these years later, we're talking about his 100th birthday, 65 years of the Twilight Zone, still on television, still revered. Sci-Fi, of course, doing those New Year's Eve. Sometimes they've done 4th of July as well. Reprises of all these fabulous episodes, which are must viewing. It is just truly amazing. He would be completely surprised by this. He was doing what he knew. He was doing what he loved. One of the things that I like about your approach, Mark, to this isn't just as somebody who admired the work, but you totally understand and get and celebrate the morality of it all, the stories, the lessons, what he was teaching us through art and entertainment, bringing us in, the twisted endings, but the message that was delivered with every single episode. And you talk about that, the way your chapters are laid out beautifully. You do come in and sort of cap it off with those lessons, with those morals. Tell us about that approach and as you were writing it, how you wanted to put it together in such a beautiful way like that, Mark.
Well, the approach was sort of decided for me a little bit by the universe, because the universe is smarter than you are, and when I was my first book was published in 1982, and your bones creak when you say that out loud. But when I was coming off that book, and
was that Columbo?
No, that was the Barter. That's the book that got written because of that's sort of getting ahead of us a second. But I'd written a theater history, a slice of history of the Barter Theater, which was one of the great regional theaters, a very colorful theater, started during the Depression in Virginia. And I had written the history of the Barter Theater. And when that book was about to be published, a lot of people asked what is a very flattering question, which is, what's your next book going to be? Because that presupposes there's going to be a next book. And I actually was thinking about writing a history of the Twilight Zone. This was, the early 80s. I was living and working in Upper East Tennessee, Southwest Virginia area, which is not the best place to try to research the Twilight Zone. But I did enough work on that to sort of fool myself into thinking I was going to write that book. Claude Akins and Fritz Weaver both had been at the Barter Theater, and I had interviewed them. Donna Douglas, who was in Eye of the Beholder, one of the great Twilight Zone episodes, came to town to shoot a commercial. And then I had an experience which is not uncommon to a lot of writers. As I walked into a bookstore, and there it was, Mark Scott Zachry's The Twilight Zone Companion, the history of the Twilight Zone. I couldn't even get angry about it because Mark did a great job. He did a landmark work on the Twilight Zone. And that's how I came to write the Columbo book. I shifted my focus to my second favorite television show and said, okay, now I'm going to try to write a book about Columbo, which is as good a book as what Mark had done on the Twilight Zone. But I all those years later and all these books later, I kind of had this silly notion that I was owed a Twilight Zone book. And you're not owed anything. That's a silly thing to think. But when my daughter turned 14, 15 years old, I started sharing the Twilight Zone with her. And we did a forced march through all 156 episodes. And we got to a first season episode called Escape Clause with David Wayne as a hypochondriac. unpleasant man named Walter Bedecker who makes a deal with the devil for immortality. And,
Yes.
Anything about the Twilight Zone, this is not going to end well for Walter Bedecker. But when the episode was over and it had run its course, I turned to Becky jokingly and said, let that be a lesson to you. Always read contracts. Always read contracts carefully. Don't sign
Yes.
anything without knowing what you're signing.
And Sebastian Cabot was in that one, right?
No, that's a different one where the devil. That's you're thinking of the one with Larry Blyden.
Yes, that's right. That's a great one too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but when this episode was over, and I was joking with Becky at the moment, but then I thought about all the people who in the financial crisis 2008 had signed things and hadn't thought about what they were signing and how much trouble it got us. So I looked back and said, well, I'm kind of serious about this. And well, this went on for a while. We would watch another episode and I'd jokingly say, let that be a lesson to you. And then after, I'm a slow learner. It took me a couple of weeks before the penny dropped and I realized this is your Twilight Zone book, because the unsaid words at the end of every Twilight Zone are the same words that end every one of Aesop's fables, And the moral of the story is, and then you fill in the blank. So I realized, well, that's what this is the universe giving you your Twilight Zone book. You need to extract these life lessons and put them within the covers of a book, and to do it in a conversational style. Do it in a way that it's not academic, it's not stuffy. Make this like a series of fun conversations like you're having with another Twilight Zone fan. So that was the approach, and that's how it happened. But again, it was a big circle back to the Twilight Zone for me. And it took the universe saying, now is the time for you to write your book. And this is the book. So,
Absolutely. Again, I can't tell you how many times when we do watch, and we've seen them over and over again, and there are certain television series where you can watch the episodes again and again and again, and you're watching them almost as if you're seeing it for the first time. There's a lot of material out there these days. You watch it once and you're like, okay, I'm good with that. But, the I Love Lucy's, the Dick Van Dykes, the Twilight Zone, some of these shows that have stood the test of time, that every single time you watch them, you're still either thinking or you're curious or you're moved or you're laughing, whatever it may be. The Twilight Zone obviously is one of those series that continues to leave this lasting impact. And no matter what year it is and what's going on in the world, it is a lasting reflection on humanity, how we treat one another, how we think about life, how we think about dealing with various issues in our lives. And it's absolutely uncanny how this brilliant mind of Rod Serling and his writers and the whole team were able to think in such a way, because this was new on television on CBS. This was something people really didn't see before. It was fresh, it was innovative, and people were very curious about it. And it is so relevant today. No matter, you can just change the year of the calendar, these storylines, these morals, these lessons about life are true to form every single day. Wouldn't you say, Anne?
Oh, absolutely. Because he dealt with the human condition and times change, but people don't change. All of these issues are still relevant, sadly prevalent. And he'd be pretty horrified by that. But yeah, we could be watching any of these today in today's world, and it's tremendously sad.
I would imagine that you probably go through your days sometimes where you see things happen before your eyes on the highway, in the supermarket, on TV, whatever. And you're like, gee, that actually reminds me of this episode Dad wrote, just in everyday living, right?
Right. And I have to say, backing up a little bit, my dad would have been delighted by Mark's book, and Mark and I had become very close friends, and he would have also been a close friend of Mark's too. So thank you, Mark, once again.
Oh, yes. Mark, when you hear that coming from Anne, are your feet tingling about now?
Oh, yeah. I mean, this is one of the great gifts of the universe. Just to have your name on a book with the Twilight Zone on it is you just don't take those things lightly. But, the greater gift has been, Anne's friendship, everything that this has led to, that this association with the Twilight Zone has led to. And I'll, Anne just very graciously said something about my book. Let me flip the switch and say, my great disadvantage in doing this book was that I did not get to meet Rod Serling. Rod died when I was in college, and I can remember the moment, that I heard it coming over the radio, like it was yesterday. And I did meet a lot of people who worked in the Twilight Zone. I got to interview people like Jack Klugman, and Richard Matheson became a very good friend who wrote a lot of the Twilight Zone episodes. But I did not get to meet Rod, and the closest anybody who's in my position is going to get to meeting the real Rod Serling is by reading Anne's book. There is the real Rod Serling. There is the person who had a great sense of humor, the practical joker, the devoted father, the father who liked to stand on his head and do guerrilla impressions, the guy who, he was not that super serious guy on the screen with his arms folded and his teeth clenched together, talking in those clipped tones. That wasn't Rod Serling. So if you want to get to know the real, the man behind the writer, the man behind the image on that screen, then seek out Anne's book, because this is where he comes alive and where you see a true, three-dimensional fellow behind the fifth dimension, if you will. And it's just it is a gift to the world, that book. And for anybody who admires Rod Serling, I say, seek out that book and do yourself a favor.
And again, I would love to have you back so we can really take a deep dive into the book. But even for you, these beautiful words that Mark is sharing, what was it like for you writing that book? As I knew him, my dad, Rod Serling, because you share things in such a beautiful way in that book, and tidbits and elements of this iconic figure to everybody, but to your father, your dad, your family member, somebody who, adored you and you adored and the other members of your family, this special bond and relationship with your father, which only you would know. What was that like, taking time to write that and honoring your dad in such a beautiful way?
Well, initially I wrote the book to navigate through my grief, because like many, I find writing cathartic. And then as I kept writing, I wanted to know more about my dad's professional life, and I wanted to put to rest any rumors that my dad was this dark and tortured soul, because he wasn't. But very central to the book was my grief too. And my editor had actually said, because it's so central, you really need to talk more and be more open about your grief. And that was difficult, but once I did it, it was very, it sort of released a lot of stuff that I'd been holding, and that had really paralyzed me when my dad died. And when I did a reading initially at the Paley Center, a woman came up to me and told me that her dad was dying, and after hearing me read, she knew she'd be okay. And it was this unexpected gift that, something that I had said had impacted her like that. But through writing the book, I did learn so much more about my dad and about the war, and how really that so defined him. I knew that he had trauma from the war, because I vividly remember him having nightmares, and I would hear him and ask him in the morning what had happened, and he would say he was dreaming that the enemy was coming at him. He had initially wanted to, when he got out of the war, he'd wanted to go to Antioch College, where his brother had gone, and major in physical education to teach kids, because he'd worked in a camp for kids with rheumatic fever, and he really wanted to work with children. But he changed his major to language and literature because, as he said, I had to get it out of my gut. I had to get it off my chest. so so I learned, about that and much more about his childhood, although I knew a lot about that. My dad talked a lot about being a kid and his parents, and he used to tell me that he used to say, if only you had known your grandfather, because
Mm.
his dad died when my father was overseas. And even though the war was over, my dad didn't have enough points to go home, so he couldn't return for his dad's funeral. But those words, if only you'd known your grandfather, I never imagined I would be saying that to my own kids too. So,
Did he describe what your grandfather was like?
yes, yes, very funny, very warm, hard worker. It was the sense of humor that really came through, because I think my dad and I actually think my uncle have very similar senses of humor, and I think it's trickled down to my kids too. So
Sort of a dry, witty sort of, and you could get senses of that, even little nuances of it in watching the Twilight Zone, a little twinkle in his eye on some of the episodes where there was a playfulness as well. I always got that from him in watching the series. I know, again, like you say, depicted as, being very serious and credible and professional and deep, but you always saw, if you really took the time to just sit back and look at him, a playfulness that was evident there as well. And that was true to form, right, Anne?
oh, there was a real silliness.
Yeah.
He would do things like walk into a room with my lampshade on his head.
Your father did that too?
And as Mark said, the gorilla impersonation. In almost every home movie, my father is pretending to be a gorilla.
Yeah.
He loved the Flintstones.
Oh, yes. You would watch together, right?
Right.
Yeah.
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 I wasn't allowed to watch TV during the week. It was our mother's rule, but I knew I could sneak it with my dad. So we would sneak several episodes of the Flintstones.
When did you first see the Twilight Zone, your father's work?
The first Twilight Zone I ever saw was Nightmare at 20,000 Feet.
Yeah.
And even though my dad didn't write that one, Richard Matheson did, I was terrified. It was just because, my dad was on screen, and it was just surreal to think. I knew my father was a writer from a very young age, but I didn't know exactly what kinds of things he was writing. So to watch that, and at that time, I don't think I knew that he hadn't written that one. It was just sort of strange and scary, because that was not the man I knew that could create something like that.
I would imagine that the first time you flew on an airplane, you were probably, like many people, looking out the window on the wing to see if there was anything there.
Still do that.
Still do. We have done that as well. If we hear a little bang or a little unusual noise, we'll look out and is William Shatner there at all? Have you ever gotten a chance to be in the company of William Shatner and ever talk about that episode or anything with him?
I did. I was actually on a panel with him, and I told him, you scared the hell out of me. And he said, I didn't write it, he said. So
he just did his incredible due diligence to perform so beautifully in that. Mark, it's hard to take all of this and sometimes put it all on paper in a way that really impacts people, and to be so open as you are, because this is your take on it, which is what I think is beautiful. Everybody has, everybody gathers what they gather from art. We all look at the same painting and we see different things. And this is your take on it, which I think is a beautiful take, because I'm right there with you on it. Coming up with the title, Everything I Need to Know, I Learned in the Twilight Zone. Tell us about the meaning of the title and how you came up with that.
Well, the title was a little bit, lighthearted. I wanted to also get out the idea that this book was not going to be a heavy tome. to slog through. I wanted something that was telegraphing the fact that it was going to be a little bit fun. So, the title is a little bit of playful, but it's not a joke. It's not, the notion that everything I need to know is actually not a joke at all. And one of the great, kicks I get, it always sounds like I'm setting up a joke when I say this, but because I do a lot of talks on the Twilight Zone, and my wife and I do a show for our theater company based on the book. And after every one of these, somebody comes up to me who identifies himself or herself as a priest, a minister, or a rabbi, and they always say, "I use your book in framing my lessons, and when I talk to my congregation, or my or in temple, or in church, or whatever." And that's one of the best compliments you can possibly get, because these are parables, and they do these are life lessons which hold up, and they come deeply from Rod Serling's beliefs and the things he cared so deeply about. Is that, as Anne said, he probably is not going to become a writer if it isn't for two things. So first, the war, and then going to Antioch College here in Ohio. It's here that he discovers writing, and he becomes a writer. And the thing about Rod Serling is that his themes do not change. If you look at what he's concerned about, you look at it's the same at the beginning of his career as it is at the end of his career. He's always kind of there. He's always writing about ignorance, prejudice, bigotry, the effects and the costs of war, how we treat the elderly, how we treat people towards the end of their lives, how we treat children, how we treat people at the beginning of their lives, the most vulnerable people in society. He's always writing about this. And he makes his name in the 1950s during the era of the golden age of live anthology shows as one of the two most prominent writers for television. He and Patty Chayefsky are the two angry young men, as they were called. And they weren't really very angry, but that's what they got tagged as. And if you look at the beginning of Rod's career in television, he's growing up with television. Television's brand new when he starts writing for television, and there are no rules. It's the Wild West when he starts. By the end of the 1950s, it's become nothing but rules, and it's got he's submitting scripts, and they're being eviscerated. Mm-hmm. Because people are saying, well, you can't say that because the sponsor won't like it, or you can't say that because this group of stations in this area of the country won't like it.
Had to battle with some of the sponsors, and
standards and practices people don't like that. So he goes to the Twilight Zone. He creates the Twilight Zone as a way of, it's a gamble. He's rolling the dice on the notion that he can still write about the exact same things he's been writing about and the things he cares about, but if he puts it into the guise of fantasy, the standards and practices people and the sponsors won't lift an eyebrow. And he was exactly right. I do a talk which I call Moralist in Disguise, and that comes from Mark Twain. And somebody had once written Mark Twain and said that he was known as a very funny man, but behind the laughter, he seemed to be wanting to teach us something. And Twain basically answered that, yes, he was a moralist in disguise. He was using humor as a way of telling people the truth about themselves, probably the most dangerous occupation a writer can have. And that's what Rod Serling did with the Twilight Zone. That's what, he finds a way to continue to get the message across, and not only get the message across, but get it in a way that's even more effective than what he had been doing. Because everybody who dropped their guard, they didn't taste the medicine when they swallowed it in these episodes, because they were so delightfully written and great storytelling. So the Twilight Zone is not different. It's not like it's a different part of Rod Serling's career. It's a direct continuation of who he is as a writer, and you can see everything he cares about and everything that he's passionate about in the Twilight Zone, as you can in every other phase of his career. He's a very consistent writer that way. I don't like it when somebody puts a word in front of the word writer, or when they say this person is a mystery writer or a science fiction writer, or whatever. It diminishes the writer. It diminishes, and I've always said, Rod Serling was not a great fantasy writer. He was not a great science fiction writer. He was a great American writer period. You do not have to qualify it in any way, shape, or form.
That's so beautifully said, and it's so true. It really is. And I like what you're talking about, moralist in disguise. He really was, and that was fresh and new on television. And I think, do you think Alfred Hitchcock was a little of that as well,
You know, Hitchcock is
in a
basically
light way, maybe?
you can define Hitchcock, Alfred Hitchcock. I love Alfred Hitchcock Presents, but Alfred Hitchcock was basically telling mystery stories, in which you had a perfect half-hour short story mystery. Thriller, which Boris Karloff was the host of, was the horror show that was on about the same time, and The Outer Limits was the science fiction show. So, what was the Twilight Zone exactly? Was it science fiction? Well, some weeks it was. Was it horror? Yeah, some weeks it was. Was it mystery? Yep, some weeks it was. It was all of those things and none of those things. The best way to define the Twilight Zone is the way that Rod Serling himself defined it in the opening. It is as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. In other words, it encapsulates everything. It is the realm of imagination. So it was able to take all of it. And the Twilight Zone is a big tent. It's a big territory, that fifth dimension. And a lot fits into it. So and the best way to describe the Twilight Zone is just to say it's the Twilight Zone. It's not one thing, and you can't pin it. So you can be a horror fan and love the Twilight Zone. You can be a science fiction fan and love the Twilight Zone, mystery fan. Everybody's welcome in. And you don't have to be any of those things, and you can still be a fan of the Twilight Zone because it's great storytelling.
You talk about various episodes, and how did you decide to lay the book out in the incredible way that you did, Mark? That must have been a painstaking process.
Not really. As a matter of fact, it was one of the most fun books I've ever written, because I approached it each day as a conversation. I was like sitting down and having a conversation with another Twilight Zone fan,
which is perfect.
So these are like 50 essays, 50 discussions, and the other thing that made it easy is something we were talking about before. The Twilight Zone is one of the very, very few shows, and Rod Serling is one of the very, very few writers who, when you read him or you look at his work, he's of his time. You watch an episode, and obviously the styles of the cars and the clothes and everything taps this into the fact that we're in a world that did not yet know cell phones or home computers or anything like that. And
how refreshing it is to go back and watch it that way, isn't it?
Yeah.
Sometimes.
But at the same time, something you have already said, Jim, it sometimes seems like he's talking more about today than he is then. And that's because of something Anne said, that human nature doesn't change. And great writers understand that. Shakespeare got that. Twain gets that. Human nature doesn't change. But the marvelous thing about Rod Serling, as a very few writers seem of their time and yet timeless, which means that if you watch it today, it still seems fresh. And it doesn't speak to us in an ancient language of some kind. It's hard to read Shakespeare. It's hard for a lot of people to get into Shakespeare. It's not hard to read Mark Twain. It's not hard to watch The Twilight Zone. It still seems like that language is very, very modern, and yet it's still of its time. Now, that is hard to pull off. That is very, very difficult thing to pull off, and very few writers do it. But the other thing is that there are certain Twilight Zone episodes, which I'm very sad to say are more resonant today than they were when they were written. And I think the number one example of this, and Anne can speak more to this, is The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street. If you look at that episode, which is about neighbors who all friends who descend into madness and chaos due to suspicion and fear and paranoia. Now, Rod was clearly writing about the McCarthy era. He's clearly writing about the Red Scare, when neighbor turns against neighbor and everybody's looking under their bed and in the closet for communists. And who are communists? They look just like everybody else. How do you know who's a communist? So he writes about how this fear and paranoia can separate us and drive us apart. And you watch that episode then, which was written during the Eisenhower administration, and it's a very powerful episode. You watch it today, and it sounds like he's talking about America today. It sounds like it's a cautionary tale for us right now, saying we are more divided than ever before. We are suspicious of each other. We are paranoid of each other. And we are going to descend into madness if we do not find a way to communicate with each other. The monsters are due on Maple Street. And, and it's just to speak to that resonance. I know, because Anne has a lovely story which to relate to this, but how the monsters are due on Maple Street is used in the schoolroom in Binghamton. Anne?
Yeah, in the Binghamton School District, all the fifth graders, there's a program called The Fifth Dimension, and all the fifth graders watch the Twilight Zone, and they learn about racism and bias and scapegoating and isolationism and etc. And they were showing the episode, The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, and at the end, the teacher asked the class, "So who are the monsters?" And she said the entire class stood up. I mean, these are fifth graders who completely understand this. So I guess that also speaks to there's hope in the future.
That's amazing. Huh? What did you feel when you heard that?
Oh, I just thought it was a stunning story, and the program is so excellent, and the teachers are just so terrific. And my dad, I think my father would have felt this was his greatest accolade, to know these fifth graders are watching these programs and they get it.
That's incredible. It really is.
And that's just one example, Jim, because there are so many, and it's another parallel to Mark Twain, is how many times people quote Mark Twain today. And it says, it sounds like he's talking about us today. It sounds like
yes.
it's like he knows who we are. And it's the same thing with the Twilight, Eye of the Beholder. With the woman whose face is wrapped in the bandages, and concepts of beauty and unrealistic concepts of beauty, and peer pressure and societal pressure to conform, to be a certain way.
And an individual struggle sometimes that people have. Remember the episode where the actor was in this beautiful suburban living room, and the picture of the wife was on the desk, and it was a very mid-century modern living room. He's in the house, and then all of a sudden they say cut, and the actor realizes and almost forgets that he's acting that role, but he wants to live in that world. He wants that fictional wife to be his wife and that life to be his life. And they keep telling him, this is just a story. You're not, just even thinking about how people wish for things that maybe aren't in their own life. The grandmother, the kids that get to pick the perfect grandmother that they wanted to have, and sort of mold her into what they want. Just amazing to be able to think in that way and to be able to share it in a 30-minute television show, and some of them were an hour as well. Just absolutely a certain mind of Rod and the writers to be able to think in this way, and to be able to get it where we get it. You know what I mean? We appreciate it, we value it, and we live it, because you can watch the whole series and there will be episodes that reflect even how you think about yourself and about life as well, in one shape or form, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. Yep. That's the power of great writing. And also, the great thing about fantasy storytelling is fantasy storytelling tends to be extraordinarily metaphoric. It's always about what is it really about? Okay, we're watching this story and it's about a man who makes a deal with the devil for immortality. But what is it really about behind all of that? And the great thing about that is, you said before about the life lessons in the book being my life lessons, and that's exactly it. They're my life. They're what I carried away from the Twilight Zone. They're not necessarily your life lessons, because fantasy, horror, science fiction, it always kind of holds up a mirror and to society and to yourself, and it's always about not what do you see when you look into what did you bring to the mirror, what dreams, what nightmares, what aspirations, what hopes, what fears. That's what shapes what you bring away from fantasy storytelling. And the great thing about the Twilight Zone is those episodes can mean different things at different ages. You watch it at one age, and because of who you are at that age, you take this away from it. But you watch it 10 years later, and you have 10 more years of life experience, and it can mean something else.
Absolutely.
One of the great kicks I get out of that talking to other Twilight Zone fans is getting their life lessons. What did they get away from it? You know?
They will have lived experiences that tie into an episode or two of the Twilight Zone. And I remember the very first episode that I saw, and I love all of them, but the very first one that I saw that really roped me in, I said, sold, I want more, believe it or not, was The Midnight Sun.
It's a wonderful episode.
And here we are being taken down a path thinking that we're getting closer and closer to the sun. And these are all the things that are happening as a result of that. The paint is melting. I don't want to give too much away in case there are generations that maybe didn't see it, but just, and the radio stops and the fan stops, and how the two women, there was Lois Nettleton was in that one. And then how they deal with just survival and what they do, and how then it plays with your mind, and, grabbing the water from the other one and it smashes, and all of these things. And it turns out to be the polar opposite. We're moving further from the sun. It's snowing, it's a blizzard, and people are having to go south as far as they can to stay warm. Just that total, I was sold, signed me up all the way through. And then Rob goes, maybe not, flip. I loved that. And I was 10 when I did see that one. Course, in reruns on WPIX Channel 11 in New York, home to the Yule log, 11 Alive. And it was, oh my God, I've never seen anything like this. I want more. I love how I was taken down a path, following along, seeing how they were working through this situation that was, a serious situation, getting closer to that midnight sun. Boom, everything isn't always what it appears, and it's the opposite. Absolutely fantastic. That was my very first taste of the Twilight Zone. What was your first taste of it, Mark?
I can never remember exactly which episode I watched first, but I remember that when I sort of dove into the reruns on WPIX, they were into the 5th season, which was not their strongest season. But I remember one of the first episodes I saw was a 5th season episode called Ring-a-Ding Girl, about an actress who goes back to her hometown. I found it a very deeply disturbing, frightening episode. And I'm not afraid. There's a whole story with a plane, and I'm not afraid to fly. I've never had any kind of fear of flying or anything like that. But that was the first episode, but it got me, right from the start. I already was a horror fan. I kind of became a horror fan at about 7 years old. And so, I just thought, this is in my wheelhouse. This is definitely, something I need to keep watching. And so, I watched as many as I could at that age. But, then, again, as when I was a teenager, that was when I really started to appreciate the writing.
Yeah.
The visuals.
Yes. The music too, the shadowing, the camera angles. Like I said, I know there's been other iterations and movies and everything, but if we're talking about the Twilight Zone, for me, the original black and whites are tough to top. Just the time period, like you say, no cell phones, things of that nature, but also the shadowing, the camera angles, and the music too was spectacular. I had Lloyd Schwartz on, of course, Sherwood Schwartz's son, Brady Bunch, Gilligan's Island, all these great shows. And one of the things I talked about with him was how important underscoring is, the musical underscoring underneath what you're watching, and how it can really enhance the feeling that you already have. It takes it to a deeper, more visceral level. The writing is there, the acting is there, but then this music comes in and it's confirming what you're watching and how important that is. And also something that we don't see, unfortunately, as much. Of course, I love jingles. I love that whole period when there were jingles, but themes, just, da, na, 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 da, na, na, na. A lot of shows today, they just come right on, a quick slide and they come right on. But when you heard that Twilight Zone music, you knew something incredible is going to happen, and you have to sit there and lock in. The music, and an incredible part of all of this, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. And people are still humming it. And
The underscoring too, the cuts of music that were used underneath as certain episodes were being shown. Really incredible. I pay attention to that and to the camera angles. And then also, I can't tell you how many times when we watch the series over and over, we've got the DVDs, we've got every way you could possibly have the Twilight Zone. You'll see so many character actors in things now, and you'll be like, see, that's the one that was in that Twilight Zone episode. Billy Mooney, Jack Klugman, this one and that one, Sebastian Cabot, then went on to Family Affair and these other shows. You'll always be going back to the Twilight Zone when they were in those episodes and seeing them in later works, movies, and television, and be like, don't you remember? That's the guy that was in that fantastic episode. Really, some amazing talent was in those episodes. Agnes Moorehead, too. Remember that episode with the UFO on her roof, which turns out to be the Americans? Just
Robert Redford, Carol Burnett.
Exactly right. Just really amazing. What has been the response to the book, Mark?
Oh, it's all been wonder. I think anybody who comes to the book comes to it with a love of the Twilight Zone or an interest in the Twilight Zone or a curiosity. So it is a conversational book, and that means that there is an unspoken part of the conversation, which is what you get out of it. So that's what I love about it. And going out and talking to people and talking to other Twilight Zone fans, you get that other part of the conversation. You get to hear what they love about it and what they think about it. But it was also the book was such a gift on so many fronts. I mean, one of the things that I did in the book was I included life lessons from what I call guest lessons. I solicited guest lessons from people who were either associated with the Twilight Zone or were Twilight Zone fans. And sometimes that came out fun because you found out people were Twilight Zone fans who you didn't know were Twilight Zone fans. Like, just in interviewing Mel Brooks, for instance, I did not solicit an interview with Mel Brooks to talk to him about the Twilight Zone. But out of conversation, it comes out that he is like one of the biggest Twilight Zone fan, Rod Serling fans in the universe.
Yes.
And I said to him, well, can you give me a life lesson for the book? I'm going to look up lessons. Without even, right off the top of his head, he gives me this life lesson. That's just fantastic. It's like he'd been thinking about it, for weeks and weeks and framing it, and it comes right out. So I got a chance to do an awful lot of that. David Chase, who invented The Sopranos, Rod Serling's his hero, and The Twilight Zone's his favorite show of all time. And I asked him for his guest lesson, and his went around the theme of something you just said about the Midnight Sun, which was don't take things as for what they seem to be.
Exactly.
Things are not always what you think they are. So right. That was one of the great gifts of the book. And the other was just being able to celebrate the Twilight Zone with this book. And two things come to drive home when you study the Twilight Zone and you research the Twilight Zone. One is how much of a team effort it was, how many people contributed to the Twilight Zone, that there were great writers like Richard Matheson and Charles Beaumont and George Clayton Johnson writing for the Twilight Zone, the music, the cinematography, the great actors you mentioned, all of the people who contributed to this, and they were all great artists and great craftsmen. That's one thing. And the other thing that drives you home is just how hard Rod Serling worked during this. It was not a one-man show, but oh my goodness. The man, there were 156 episodes of The Twilight Zone. Rod wrote 92 of them. That is an astonishing number. If that's all he had done, that would have been an epic effort in any way, shape, or form. But he's also the executive producer.
Yeah.
He's the showrunner. He's the lead writer. He's the narrator. He's the on-air
host,
the
right?
creator.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know how he in some ways he survived it, because that is, and you know, and in doing so, Rod also has an incredible impact on TV history, because he creates the role of the showrunner, the eye of the writer producer who is in charge of the vision and shaping the vision. Not that other people do not contribute. He kind of creates, you know, Carl Reiner is going to do it on the comedy side with the Dick Van Dyke Show a couple of years later.
Mm-hmm.
And Carl Reiner was a big Twilight Zone fan as well. But he's, first off, he does it a couple years after Rod. Rod is really there in 59, and he kind of creates this role that later writers like Matthew Weiner, who did Mad Men, and Vince Gilligan, who did Breaking Bad, and David Chase, they all say, you know, that Rod's their hero. Rod's the guy who, you know, and they don't do fantasy. They're not, these are not fantasy.
No.
People going on doing like Star Trek and the X-Files,
right?
Which we know are shaped by the Twilight Zone. These are people who doing drama.
And Anne and I were talking about that when we were setting things up, is all of these people within the industry who revere her father, Rod Serling, and who are inspired and empowered by his take on life and his way of doing things and his incredible writing. And there are elements of Rod Serling that sort of the tentacles spread out in other work that other people are doing, where they reference Rod Serling in such a phenomenal way. And Anne, that's very special, isn't it?
Right, it is. And to how much he worked. When I was writing my memoir, I read an article that said he worked 12 hours a day. And yet I never felt that my dad wasn't accessible. In fact, for years, when I would come home from school, we'd play basketball in the backyard together. So yes, he was incredibly prolific and an incredibly hard worker, but he was also always there at the dinner table, and he had an office in the backyard. He was always, you know, present. I could tell, though, sometimes when he was writing in his head, because I'd be talking to him and he'd get this look on his face, and I knew that he was writing in his head. So he'd sort of disappear for moments sometimes.
Was it like a serious look or a focused look?
Something came over him, but I knew what it was.
That's amazing. But like you said, at home, a loving, doting father, and really cared about you and the family, and made sure that, you know, as the best as possible time was made. And that's a beautiful thing. Well, you know, we're talking about 100 years, and happy birthday in heaven, Rod Serling. It's not always that I have several friends who are also the children of celebrities, and they're not always speaking so highly of their parent. They appreciate the work, the effort, they appreciate the product, but the home situation wasn't, you know, it took a back seat or just wasn't really there. And here you are continuing, and all these years later, to be able to talk about your father in such a beautiful, loving, warm, authentic way. People are probably loving, knowing, and hearing that. And for him to try to the best of his ability to balance all of the demands of Hollywood and television and writing. And, you know, we want more Rod Serling, more, you know, do Night Gallery, do this, do that, but yet still be the dad and the loving father and all the rest. It's a beautiful thing.
I don't forget for a day how fortunate I was to have this man as my dad. what more can I say? He was an incredibly beautiful person and a terrific dad.
Which people, again, super fans love knowing. And you're so open about that. And again, I'd love to have you back to talk about your book and get into more of that as well. Mark, you reference a particular episode that was a phenomenal one with one of the great actors who also did some really terrific voiceovers for Honda, Burgess Meredith.
Mm-hmm.
And people remember, of course, from the Rocky movies. And I miss him. He was so unique. But in this particular episode here that we remember, the sort of twisted ending that happened there with the glasses and the books and everything. Tell us about your perspective on that episode and maybe how you think you would love for it to have possibly ended.
Well, this comes up a lot because of my take on it, because, I don't know that this episode would make a lot of fans' number one episode if you asked for a vote of the greatest Twilight Zone episodes. And because I have a slightly different take on it, people tend to say, oh, you don't like that episode. And I said, no, I love that episode. It's not that at all. You cannot help but admire Burgess Meredith's performance in this episode, which is sublime. You cannot admire how it is shot, how it is filmed. It has, one of the, if not the most iconic images from all 5 years of the Twilight Zone, and that's the broken glasses. So how can you not admire this episode and love this episode? However, the Twilight Zone operates under certain rules. And one of the standing rules of the Twilight Zone is that you are punished or rewarded for what you bring into the Twilight Zone. In other words, if you are a character who brings in hatred and prejudice and ignorance, you are probably going to take it in the shorts in the Twilight Zone before the half hour is over. You're going to get hit with one solid piece of cosmic justice.
And we watching are hoping that happens.
And on the flip side, if you bring in kindness, if you bring in, caring, if you're good to children, you are probably going to be rewarded in some way. This episode, the payoff for this episode, what this character gets hit with is way out of proportion to anything that he's done. What is his crime? Well, he wants to read. Well, how dare he want to read? Especially now, today, this message gets worse and worse because you're in an era where the printed word is under fire and literacy rates are dropping and all of this. So, and he is not the villain of the piece. The villain of the piece are his that terrible boss, that awful wife, who is just one of the worst characters in all the 5 seasons of the Twilight Zone. But there was no way I could not put this one in the book. I mean, how could you ignore this episode with 50 life lessons? So I had to put a lesson to it. And the lesson I put to it was something my mother used to say to us, which was when we would say, well, that isn't fair. And my mother would say, nobody said life was fair. Mm-hmm. And that's what he says. That's what the character says at the very end when the glasses break and he holds them up and he says, that's not fair. And we agree with him. It is not fair. It is out of proportion. And so it's a bit of an outlier as far as Twilight Zone episodes go. And maybe it has that much impact because of that. I have heard it said, people say, well, his real crime is he's so self-absorbed that's why it's like, it's almost a comment on cell phones today and things like that. And I said, no, because he is not self-absorbed. If you look at that episode, he's trying to share his love of writing with everyone throughout that episode. People who are on cell phones never look up. He looks up. Right. And one of the great, wonderful, and awful moments in this episode is when he goes home and the wife says she's found his poetry book. He has secreted it.
Yes.
And she says, read it to me. And he thinks, oh, she finally gets it. She finally comes over to this love, and now we can share this. I can finally share this with my wife. And he opens the book, and she has defaced every page. So not one single line of one poem can be read, which is one of the most cruel and vicious acts in the Twilight Zone. He's not the villain here. He's
No.
not, you know, he may have his flaws and he may have his, but to have that as his payoff. So I had to put a lesson to it. And the lesson was, you know, every once in a while, even in the Twilight Zone, you know, nobody said life was fair. And I acknowledge that. I acknowledge the wisdom of that. And I agree with it, but I don't have to like it, you know? So
Right.
it's not my favorite Burgess Meredith episode. My favorite Burgess Meredith episode is The Obsolete Man.
Oh,
I
yeah.
think holds up. I think, and that's another episode which has grown in resonance. And there is a book lover, who, you know, somebody who is obsessed with books, who is truly heroic, and you admire him all the way through. It's a beautiful performance, and it's a beautifully written episode.
You know, it's a lot of times it was you get what you ask for too. Mickey Rooney wanting to be taller and taller and taller as a jockey, and then all of a sudden he gets that wish, and then he's too big for the apartment that he's in. And then the other guy that wanted everything to stop. Everything was noise, people's voices, cars, garbage trucks, too much noise, and he wanted no more noise. And then there's no sound at all. You get what you wish for. Karma.
Yeah.
Well, right.
Careful what you wish for.
Just these are life lessons. And we are so blessed that Rod Serling and company took the time. Not easy putting a television show on. We know that, working in the industry, not easy doing that kind of work, but doing it. We lost him, of course, way too soon. I remember when the announcement came on the news. I remember also seeing it in the newspaper. I even still have the clippings. Newsday out on Long Island. It was on the front page. And it was just, he was one of those people that you would think would always obviously be here. And, but he is in spirit in a beautiful way. He is through Anne. He is through your work, Mark, and everybody else who, all of us that revere him. And
he is through his own work.
And right, exactly. He experimented with it and did some of those 1 hour episodes. I remember the one where the guy was collecting all of those historic mannequin figures in his basement and dusting them off and polishing them off. And then, you know, the wife doesn't like them. And then they, you know, the Boston Strangler and all these different ones, these horrific people from the past. And then they come to life and then they sort of get him and then he becomes one. Did you favor the 1 hours, or are you true to form and prefer the 30-minute versions of this series?
Anne?
Well, I think most people would say the 30-minute versions were much better. Mark can speak to that more than I can, but I would agree to that. I would agree. Yeah.
I think shows find their natural length. They find their, like, water seeks its level. I think, you know, and the Twilight Zone was, you know, inherently a half-hour show. You know, that's where the rhythms work. They got in and out. It's almost like short story writing. And short story writing is incredibly difficult to do. It's among writers, it's accepted to be one of the most difficult things to do, to get in and out in just a very few words and have a full story arc and have a few, you know, that's hard to do. And the Twilight Zone did that as a half hour. At an hour, it often seemed padded. It just almost like it was not their natural storytelling. Like, having said that, there are some exceptional hour episodes. On Thursday We Leave for Home with James Whitmore is one of the great performances in the 5 years of the Twilight Zone. So it's not that there aren't some great hour episodes. It's just that I think they understood that this was not their natural storytelling length. And then for the fifth season, they go back to the half hour. And the fifth season actually starts very strong. The fifth season, that first batch of episodes in the fifth season, it starts with In Praise of Pip, which is one of my favorite episodes.
Yes, yeah.
And one of my favorite Klugman performances.
Jack Klugman, yeah.
You know, but Nightmare at 20,000 Feet is in that batch. You know, Steel, Richard Matheson stories in there. They got off to a really good start in the fifth season. Then by the end of the fifth season, it really feels like they're out of gas.
What about Night Gallery? I know we're focused on Twilight Zone, but maybe slip in a little about Night Gallery. Did you enjoy Night Gallery as well, or was it hard to embrace because of how good the Twilight Zones were? What both feel about that?
Well, I know my dad was excited but very apprehensive when Night Gallery was coming out. He was concerned that it would be compared to the Twilight Zone. And eventually he was pretty discouraged with the whole show because, unlike with the Twilight Zone, he didn't have creative control over Night Gallery. And I think he was on the Dick Cavett show, and he said it had become just a skip through a cemetery or something like that. But that said, there were some beautiful scripts in the Night Gallery. One of my favorites was They're Tearing Down Tim Riley's Bar, which is similar to the Twilight Zone Walking Distance. My dad said he had a propensity to write about the past, and it's a gorgeous script.
Where do you think a lot of these ideas and this feeling that your father was able to convey in such a beautiful way with this legacy of all these shows, where do you think that, what did he draw upon? And I don't know if you ever got a chance to chat with him about that, but where do you think, is it his own family upbringing, his experiences as a child, the things that interested him in his life? Where do you think that extra secret sauce came from in his life to be able to so beautifully with the team express the way he has, and this legacy and body of work that we all still revere, this take on the human condition? Where do you think that initially or innately comes from with your dad?
Well, I think certainly from his childhood too. And I would say probably the two most defining things in my dad's life that made him who he was were his childhood and the war. He grew up in a very progressive family. They were Jewish, but they did celebrate Christmas. It was a Reformed Jewish family. So, yeah, he would say he had a very idyllic childhood.
Yeah.
And of course,
was it like Willoughby?
Well, yeah, right. Walking, right. But Willoughby, I think there was a piece of that
Yes.
my dad really wanted, just simpler times.
Don't we all too? Especially now more than ever, right, Mark?
Oh yeah, yeah, and I agree. You don't have to have a yearning for a childhood like Rod had. You just have to have a yearning for your own childhood or your own, for a time that a yearning for something that was in the past. That like I said, I agree that the two things are his childhood, which he carries this nostalgia through, and the thing that ended his childhood, which was the war. It brutally changes. He almost has this kind of idyllic life up to the point he graduates high school. And that's not to say he hasn't encountered prejudice at this point or anything like that. It's not like he's blind to things at that point, but he goes from having a largely, blessed life to being thrown into one of the most horrific experiences. Rod was a paratrooper in the South Pacific.
That's right.
He was doing a very dangerous job in a very dangerous place. And, he comes back from the war badly wounded. And and he himself says, he's physically wounded because he takes shrapnel in his wrist and his knee, and the knee continues to give out. Anne could talk to him, falling down the stairs, or the knee spontaneously bleeding, so he carries the scars of this, but he himself says on a number of occasions, the psychological scars, the ones you don't see, are the ones that are much more profound. So the war, if it's not for, as we said before, if it's not for the war and it's not for these experiences and these two things sort of setting him up, they turn him into a writer. I mean, I think it's always there. I think he probably always was a writer, just didn't know it.
Mm-hmm.
But he's forced to confront this at Antioch. He's forced to confront these psychological scars, and he turns to writing for that reason. But then he never stops. You know, there are certain writers who are called compulsive writers, which means they're always writing. Even when they're not writing, they're writing. They're just constantly writing. And you look at Rod's output from the moment he starts writing at Antioch College right to the end. It's staggering how much he writes and how he just keeps going. You know, Tennessee Williams was a compulsive writer. Mark Twain was a compulsive writer. These were writers who were always writing, and it makes you hungry for and you know about because the misquote that everybody always uses for F. Scott Fitzgerald is that there's no second acts in American lives, which is nonsense. We love second acts. We're a nation of second acts. And
that's right.
And for Rod Serling, the Twilight Zone was the second act. You know, he has this amazing first act with the live television era and Patterns and Requiem for a Heavyweight. And then he's got the Twilight Zone. And then he has a third act with Planet of the Apes.
That's right.
You know, the TV movies and Night Gallery. I have no doubt. I have no doubt that there would have been a very exciting fourth act. He would not have stopped writing. He was, like I said, he was a compulsive writer. It would have been impossible for him to have stopped writing. And I'm sure that probably the next frontier was probably going to be novels and plays. You know, and I could be, you know, I'm speculating. I'm playing with the bank's money. I have no idea whether that's true or not, but I suspect very strongly that's where he would have gone.
Absolutely. I'm right there with you, Mark. I think so as well. Do you think, Anne, you know, obviously with the Twilight Zone, he was also on camera as the series went on, as the narrator, as the host, as the figure, you know, sometimes with the cigarette, sometimes without, with that sort of very incredible delivery and then the nice pressed suits and do you think he embraced that part of it as well? He was a personality. He was a host as much as a writer and dreaming up all of these incredible scenarios. He became a beloved on-air, on-camera figure as well.
Sure. He was actually not intended to be on camera. I think it was Orson Welles who did it initially, or maybe it was Orson Welles that was too expensive, and then they finally circled back to my dad and asked him if he wanted to do it. And it wasn't completely unnatural for him. I mean, when he was at Antioch and doing radio, he, you know, wrote the scripts, he acted out the scripts, he directed them, so it was familiar territory. And I think he loved it, actually.
I think so too.
You know, this is one other parallel with Mark Twain is that, you know, Rod Serling and Mark Twain were two of the very few writers in all of history who were also true 24-karat celebrities. You know, now that's odd. I mean, because most writers are anonymous. Most writers live behind keyboards of some kind or a pen and paper of some kind. And, you know, they're anonymous to most people. And they remain anonymous. It's like you show the average American a picture of Herman Melville and see if they know who it is, you know, or Emerson or Hawthorne. You know, Twain was one of the most conspicuous people on the planet. He could be recognized. Somebody once sent a letter to Mark Twain, which was simply addressed Mark Twain anywhere in the world. And the letter got to him. It was delivered. And Rod Serling was, because of television, was the most recognized writer on the planet of his time. There's no second choice here. You know, they not only could recognize who he is, they know how he talks. They know his mannerisms. They know how you know. This is rare that somebody, you know, actually is a writer and also a true celebrity. And the other parallel between he and Twain is they liked it. They were both hams. They both liked the spotlight. They saw nothing wrong with liking the spotlight and being on stage, and they were good at it. And, you know, everybody's like, well, on camera, you know, we said before, you know, Rod always comes across as stiff. Not always. You see Rod in interviews sitting down, and a lot of the sort of the natural guy starts to come out, and you see the witty guy and the fun guy.
Fascinating, his interviews.
Take a look at his guest appearance on the Jack Benny Show.
Yes.
Where he plays himself.
Yes.
And his comic timing is perfect.
Just saw that recently again. Yes.
He's really good in that. He's really funny. And he's not like a writer who's just there because of his name, and then it becomes a stiff performance, and they're just using him for that. He's good.
He's good.
Really good. So yeah, I mean, he there was a performer in there. There was this guy who liked to perform.
If you were to have a dream scenario, Mark and Anne, where Mark Twain and Rod Serling are in the same room and they decide to collaborate on something, what would that be like?
It'd be a very smoky room, I'll tell you that right now. That's another parallel, is Twain and his 40 cigars a day. So I don't know what they might have collaborated. All I know is it would have probably been extraordinarily insightful about the human condition, because they were two of the most keenest observers of the human and often inhuman condition.
Mm-hmm.
I think it would have been, I think they would have liked each other enormously. Yeah. I think that there would have been, there's a lot of writers you would have put together and you thought, well, now it's good. But I think that would have been a very good.
I think they would have appreciated one another's humor too, don't you?
Oh yeah, and they were both. I mean, they had a lot in common. They're both big animal lovers. They both were, so Twain was more cats and Rod was more dogs, but they were both big animal lovers. They were both really devoted fathers to daughters. They both prized. They both end up the day making up stories for their daughters. Which is you can't fault them on this at all. They're really aces when it comes to that.
Absolutely. You knew a lot going into it, writing the book. What are a few things you learned in writing the book about Rod Serling, about the series, about any of it?
Oh, for me, it was just the sheer scope of the writing. Vincent Price once said that the man who limits his interests limits his life.
Mm-hmm.
And I always thought that was a great quote. He
was
fantastic. Not talking about Rod Serling. He was just talking about life in general. And that's one thing that I really, realized, just not just how interested he was, but passionate about it. You read Rod when he talks about the letters he wrote or things he wrote about what was going on in the world and things like that. And I don't think it was possible for him to blunt the passion, the blunt the belief that he had. It just bowls you over. So it was always there, but it was magnified by the research. If I had, sometimes you dig deeper research into somebody and you come away with them as more human, and so you also come away from maybe feeling a little less, heroic about them and things like this. I can honestly say Rod got more heroic in what I was writing about him, and no less human,
right? Yeah,
but just better and better.
Absolutely. How about you, Anne? What are some things that you learned through the process as well? I mean, he was your dad. But maybe there's some little nuggets you learned as well.
Well, one of the most difficult parts of writing the book was reading the letters that my dad wrote to his parents, and they wrote to him when my father was in training camp. And my dad was only 18. He actually enlisted in the war the day after he graduated from high school. He'd wanted to go to Germany and fight the Nazis, but these letters just were heartbreaking. He would write things like, could they send him candy? Could they send him a belt? Could they send him new underwear because he didn't like the GI underwear? And he sounded like a kid at camp. And to know, as I'm reading these letters, what the horrors he's about to be thrown into, it was, like I said, it was heartbreaking. And the letters, particularly the ones from his father to him, there was just so much love back and forth with his mom too. And she was so worried about him. It was a real learning experience and difficult in many ways. But I also learned how prolific my dad was. And I didn't realize that, because when I began the book, it was really, as I said, more to navigate through my grief. But I learned so much about what he was writing and the number of scripts that he'd written. I think there were 252 scripts or something. Um,
There was a lot more episodes to her series at that time, right? Than even
and the episode actually that Mark was talking about in praise of Pip was, I hadn't watched many of the Twilight Zones when my dad was alive, and I didn't start until really after he died, more to see him than the show. But when I watched that episode, and there's a routine in it, there's a dialogue in it where he says to Bill Mummy, "Who's your best buddy?" "You are, Pop." And it was a routine that my father and I did. So I literally found my dad sort of in the Twilight Zone watching that episode, and it pretty much knocked me out to see our routine there.
In the incorporating elements of his own life in the storylines themselves.
Exactly.
Have you ever had a chance to talk to Billy Mooney at all
Yeah,
over the years?
he's lovely.
Yeah, huh? He's iconic. That's that one, and the one where he's talking to the grandmother that passes, and he talks to her on the phone. Something that any kid would love to have the opportunity to do. You know, when a loved one passes and you're a little kid, but you only get to hear them talking to them on the phone. I mean, just really so many incredible things. Do you have a favorite episode, or is that really tough to have a favorite episode?
Well, probably that one, because I found my dad and me in it.
Yeah.
Also, Walking Distance. Certainly. Stop at Willoughby.
Yeah.
Death's Head Revisited is a powerful, powerful show.
There's another episode that I really liked where the couple wake up, they're a tree, and they had been drinking, and they must have had a car accident. They don't know what happened, but they're in this suburban town where there's nobody, but they hear giggling, they hear voices. There's a church bell. They run into the church. There's nothing there. And they realize that the whole scenario that they're in, the town that they're in, the train doesn't really go anywhere, and everything is fake. It's all fake grass. The cigarette drops, burns the grass. And then the girl's hand comes and scoops them up. And now they're, play dolls for this girl in another time zone, planet, orbit, what have you, universe. Totally out of left field. Love that episode, just because you're going along and you're following them and rooting for them, hoping that they find somebody that's alive, somebody that's going to respond. I mean, you go into a church, you at least hope there's a pastor in there, and not even in a church is there anybody. There's like a message in that. There's nobody even there. And then it turns out to be, again, another twisted ending, and just really fantastic stuff. You guys are keeping it all alive by writing, and Mark, you're working on more, right? More things. You got more books coming out, more things you're working on.
Actually, yeah, and I'll correct you one thing that because you must have been looking at an old bio. I actually ended my newspaper career about 5 years ago.
You did?
Wow. I was the TV critic at the Cleveland Plain Dealer up to about 5 years ago this April. And
did you get a gold watch?
No, I shifted to writing books full time. Which I probably should have done earlier. I just didn't, have the right push.
Do you miss the day-to-day of doing working for the paper? Not.
No.
Yeah.
No, I don't. It was a great way. Look, there's no way to make it sound bad that you were paid for being a TV critic for all those years.
Yes, right.
It was a wonderful gig, especially in the 1980s and 90s when there was, television was huge and newspapers were huge.
I used to collect the TV guides.
It was great. It was a great job. So, no, I was blessed to do it as long as I did, and it certainly gave me access to write about certain things like Columbo and I did a book on the Night Stalker, the culture. And matter of fact, that's one of the things I'm doing. I just revised that book.
That's great.
And my most recent book is a biography of Edgar Allan Poe.
Wow.
called A Mystery of Mysteries: The Death and Life of Edgar Allan Poe, and it's done very well for St. Martin's. And my next book is going to be about Mark Twain. 5 of my books are about Mark Twain, and I think I've got one more in me. And I think it's going to be my ultimate statement on Mr. Clemens. And so I've been staying busy. You know, I mean, in the last few years, I've done a book on the Shawshank Redemption, the making of that movie, and the connections it's had. And so I'm a little bit all over the map. You know, if I could stick to one thing, I'd be successful. You know, but. It's a very schizophrenic resume, you know.
But that's par for the course, right? You're a creative. I know how that is. You got your fingers in this and hat and that. Yeah.
You go with whatever's, you know, the passion is at the moment. It's
where
got
that inspiration is. Exactly.
And I don't like repeating myself. So, you know, I do tend to go from one thing to another, you know. And
that's it. Always thinking. How about you, Anne? Things that you're doing and working on as well?
I'm working on a novel.
Oh, fantastic. That's
Taking
great.
its time now.
You enjoy the writing process as well? Is that something that's coming naturally to you?
Good days.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's very frustrating. On good days, I love it.
Will you take a breath, walk away from it, and then come back to it when you're reinvigorated and re-inspired?
Yes, the problem with the novel is I've taken too big a breath and walked too far away. So I need to circle back.
You got to set a plug back in.
Yeah.
As we celebrate, could you imagine the 100th birthday? That is really extraordinary. And again, you both have been doing such a beautiful job in honoring your dad and the revered Rod Serling and the way that you have, and pen and verbally. And it's an absolute delight and an honor, a pleasure to have you both here. Mark, I feel like I'm talking to somebody across the street, you know, at a diner, about somebody that we both love and revere. And you've written about it, and I've had an opportunity to relish in it all. And Anne talking about it in honoring the iconic stature of this gentleman who was extraordinary, but will always have this special, deep place in your heart as dad to you and to your family. I really appreciate the both of you stopping by the Jim Masters show. It's what we do. It's conversational. It's sort of Dick Cavett, Merv Griffin style, nothing prescripted, free-flowing, conversational. And I'm honored that the both of you took this time. I know it's a busy time for both of you to stop by our series. And as I always say, porch light on all the time. And the porch light is on for both of you to return. Love to have you on, Anne, to talk more about your book, which is absolutely a must read. And Mark, thank you for sharing this book with us and your personal take on it all. And a pleasure to have you here, Mark.
Oh, and I'll add one more thing, which is, you know, Anne and I are both on the board of the Rod Serling Memorial Foundation.
Yes.
And, you know, for anybody in the New York area, I would strongly suggest, because this past year, this past September, after years of effort, the foundation saw a dream come true, which was the installation of a statue in Rod's honor in Recreation Park in Binghamton, New York, which is the park where he grew up. There's a carousel in the park, which is decorated with scenes from the Twilight Zone. And the statue, which is Rod before an open door, and around the door it says, "You unlock this door with the key of imagination." And Rod is standing up on a hill and looking out towards his neighborhood home near where he grew up. It's a wonderful tribute to Rod, and it was a dream come true. And here in the state of Ohio, there's going to be an installation in this coming October at Antioch College of a state historical marker in Rod's honor. And so the honors and the tributes continue. You know, when you say like Rod is still with us, he very much is very much with us.
Is there a website people can learn about the foundation?
There is indeed. The Rod Serling Memorial Foundation. You do a search on that, it'll take you right to the website.
Right there. Fantastic. So that's Binghamton. So Binghamton, and then you can make a little drive if you're a real TV buff to Jamestown and Celeron, New York, and see
Lucy.
the Lucy Desi and the Lucy statue, and then get on a plane and fly to Minneapolis to see Mary Tyler Moore's throwing in the hat bronze statue, and I think is it Minnesota or Wisconsin where Marion Ross just also had a bronze of her, and really amazing. These are just iconic figures in our lives, and really beautiful. Thanks for keeping the memories alive and being so open and real and authentic with us here. I know our viewers absolutely loving this, and we encourage folks to comment below in the comment section if you have favorite episodes of the Twilight Zone or any of the incredible work that Rod Serling has left and gifted all of us, and any memories of favorite episodes and what have you. And also, folks who are young budding writers, folks in the industry who see Rod's work and are admiring the conversation we're having. There's generations that are still being exposed to this work as it airs on television and in DVD and Blu-ray form and all the rest. So Mark, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the time with me as much as I have with you.
Well, you can tell how shy and retiring I am, and it's nice to get out of my.
Are you doing your Jack Benny right now? I love it. Yeah.
Well, no.
Well. Exactly. A real pleasure. And I love the room that you're in. There's a lot of collectibles and different things back there, huh?
This is my labyrinthian office. And it has got bits and pieces from all sorts of parts of my life and such. So yeah, there's a little bit of everything there.
Love that. Love that. And of course, I have a lot of the Twilight Zone paraphernalia. We also have the I Dream a Genie bottle, the hand-painted bottle there as well. And then over down here, we have a little bobblehead of Bob Denver Gilligan from Gilligan's Island that Dream of Denver, his lovely wife, sent along when she was a guest and said, you're missing something from the set. I said, what are we missing? We have all these things. You're missing a Bob Denver Gilligan bobblehead. I said, I didn't know there was one. And all of a sudden in the mail. So Gilligan is right over there talking to Jeannie, trying to figure out how he's going to slip into the bottle and say hi to Barbara Eden. It's amazing. People love these shows and these figures. And thank you again for spending time with us. Mark, a real pleasure. Keep me posted on the other work. I'd love to have you back, celebrate Mark Twain and other things you're doing.
Okay, sure.
You be well, my friend.
I'm a tough get, Jim. You got to ask me.
That's it. Keep the coffee hot from Mark. Yes. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
All right. We'll chat again soon. And Anne, thank you. An honor and a privilege. And definitely I would love to chat with you again and talk about your book. That would be an honor. And I hope you enjoyed the time with me as much as I absolutely have with you.
I absolutely did. Thank you so much, Jim.
You be well and you take care. We'll chat again soon, okay?
Sounds great.
Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.
They're both going off into the Twilight Zone of their own, one in Ohio, one up in upstate New York. Let me show you the covers of the books. First, this one here. This is Mark's book, Everything I Need to Know I Learned in the Twilight Zone. It's available, of course, where books are sold. Amazon, you can get it as well. And here's Anne's book, and we're going to try our best to have Anne back based on her schedule. We would love to have her back because I'd really love to get in further about this book, because this book as well is a must read. It's a beautiful, heartwarming way that she's written this in a personal way. As I knew him, my dad, Rod Serling, and she shares, beautiful photos and things of that nature. She's so open and real, and she realizes, the love that people and the appreciation, respect that people have for her father, which I think is a beautiful thing. And so she shares all of that and so much more in her book. So whether you're a Twilight Zone fan or not, or maybe you're just discovering the series now and the other work of Rod Serling, what a terrific conversation this was, right? And that's what we do here, not really interviews. We do conversations. Me Big fan of Twilight Zone. Always have been one of my all top 10 favorites. Absolutely. And always, when you take a look at the rankings in the industry from the magazines and TV critics and all the rest, the Twilight Zone always ranks very, very high as one of the greatest television series of all time, and rightfully so. What a terrific trip down memory lane here on the Jim Masters Show, Entertainment Lifestyle Celebrity Talk Show series. If this was your first time here, thank you so much for joining us. A real honor, privilege, and pleasure to have you here as well. We have some great guests, great conversations, and we always learn something new as well. So pleasure to have you here. And also, if you're watching, of course, on the YouTube channel, we would love it if you give this episode a thumbs up, click like, share this episode on your social media, subscribe to our YouTube channel, Jim Masters TV, where there's hundreds and hundreds of great guests, celebrity friends, and special guests. And leave a comment below in the comments section. Right below there, you can comment, you can interact with us here on the show. And we love hearing your comments, and we read them and we appreciate them. Once again, we thank our very special guests, Mark for joining us and Anne for joining us as well. Two very, very special people. There is Mark's book, Everything I Need to Know I Learned in the Twilight Zone. Ain't that the truth, huh? And there's Aaron's book as well, As I Knew Him, My Dad, Rod Serling. Truly an incredible talent, but you got a chance to learn a little bit more about the man himself from one person that studied him, Mark, and another person that knew him as Dad. And how cool. Mark really does look a lot like Mark Twain, doesn't he? It sounds a little bit like him as well. It's a small world, folks. Come see us again here at the Jim Masters Show. We love having you here. And whether we're taking you down memory lane or we're introducing you to new folks on the scene, we're always having a good time with all of you. I'm your host, Jim Masters, thanking you for your time this time. Till next time, you can follow us on social media, on Facebook, X, and Instagram at Jim Masters TV. And stick with us for more great episodes and more great guests, celebrity friends, and more here on the Jim Masters Show. For all of us, be well, take care, and we'll see you in the Masters Zone on the next episode. Thanks, everybody, and cheers.